Hello and welcome to the Musical Instrument Investigator. Today we're on the website of Amati Auctions based in the UK, and we're going to have a look at their latest sale, which seems to be the third part of some big collection that they've been selling off. If anyone has been watching my videos or knows Amati, you'll know that over the last maybe year or two they've had some kind of big collections that they've sold off with some pretty interesting speculative stuff, and this seems to be the last installment of that. Quite a lot of stuff in this auction. It says that it's finishing on Wednesday the 24th of July, but when I look at the catalogue it seems to be finishing on the 24th and 25th, so it's a split 2-day auction, but they don't seem to be saying this for some reason. I don't really know why, but anyway, just be careful if you're looking to bid on anything. Have a look and make sure that the lot you're bidding on is finishing on the day that you think it is, because like I said, some stuff 24th, some stuff 25th, and here, if you see here at the top, the end date is the 25th of July, so it's not very clear, so just bear that in mind. So obviously what we're going to do is normally is go through this catalogue and see if we can find anything interesting. I'm just going to say now, this catalogue is so speculative beyond belief that all I can do is just do my normal comments and be like, this is interesting or whatever. It's really difficult. Like, there'll be experts that will know like that there's some really good stuff in this, but kind of us mere mortals, we just need to try and look at the evidence and make decisions based on that. So this is so speculative, this auction. There's only so much I can offer. There's a lot of lots in this auction, a lot of lots. 376, that's a crazy amount. I'll try and get through this as quickly as possible. It might be a long video, so bear with me. But I think there's some interesting stuff in here. So buyer's premiums 22%, so bear that in mind. You need to pay that on top of whatever the final hammer price is. This is a UK based auction, so bear in mind import export fees, shipping, all of that stuff. You can see all the terms here, CITES restrictions for ivory, tortoiseshell, all of that fun. And do remember that half of this auction is finishing on the 24th and the other half on the 25th of July. So yeah, let's see how we go. As always, I'm just going to go through the catalogue just to say that I'm going to start uploading my videos onto another platform alongside YouTube, just to kind of mitigate against potential risks of funny things happening to the channel, because it's all got a bit weird recently. So I'm going to start uploading on another channel as well. So anyway, this is going to be a long video. I apologise in advance. Also apologise for it being probably really vague in a lot of places, but what can we do? But anyway, let's start, because there's a ridiculous amount of things. Looks like I'm zoomed out quite a lot. Maybe we can zoom in a little bit more to give ourselves a bit more information. So nickel mounted double bass bow branded HR Fretschner. We can see we've got bids already. Quite a long time to go actually before this auction finishes. It's the 13th of July today. The catalogue's already been up quite a while, so they've had this up for quite a while, which is a bit unusual for them. Silver mounted double bass bow branded El Morazon. There, current bid 30. I mean, all of the stuff in this auction is kind of interesting. There's nothing really terrible, and I think it kind of sits in between their affordable auction and their specialist. Like, there's some stuff which I think is quite decent. So we got a silver mounted cello bow branded faintly on frog. If there's anything really interesting, we will stop. Nickel mounted cello bow unbranded. Silver mounted cello bow branded Gustav Prager. Just have a look at that. It's interesting, no condition reports up yet, but I guess it is quite early into the auction. They do usually have condition reports. Nickel mounted cello bow unbranded. A lot of this stuff we're just going to whiz through. This is a bit more interesting. Silver mounted cello bow branded E Blondele à Paris. Okay. Looks interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have the condition reports here, because it would be interesting to see that, but in a way maybe it makes the video go a bit quicker. Silver mounted cello bow unbranded. I mean, I think if you are very knowledgeable, you'll be able to tell from these pictures what you're looking at. Me, bow's not so strong, so it's a bit more of a difficult thing for me. I do believe they're actually doing a viewing on this auction actually one day on Monday the 22nd, I believe. Nice octagonal stick there, at their usual place in London, the Langham. I will try, if I can, actually go on my lunch break and take a few videos, because I do work just down the road from the Langham, so I might be able to do that. It's a cello bow branded PR LeBlanc. Interesting there. So yeah, I will try and take a few videos. nickel mounted cello bow branded Jean Schmidt. So yeah, bows aren't really my knowledge sphere. I think we'll see a lot of these bids going up quite high in the future. Obviously we're way too early into the auction here. So cello bow branded Bazin there. Silver mounted cello bow branded Paul Mongenot. I mean, a lot of this stuff looks halfway decent, to be honest. 170 bid on that. Obviously you can check the measurements and weights and things like that. Those of you that are players or dealers, if anyone watches these videos, you'll probably know what the ideal kind of lengths and weights are and things like that, so bear that in mind. Silver mounted cello bow branded Vigneron Paris. Now I have looked at this catalogue quite a lot, so there are a few things mainly from the instrument side of things that I think are interesting, and some things have had some pretty hefty bids already, so I think that is an indication that there is some good stuff in here. Kind of odd kind of repair there. Once again, would be interesting to see the condition reports on these. I think that because this auction is up so early for Amati, I'm sure those condition reports will appear at some point. Silver mounted cello bow unbranded. Nickel mounted cello bow branded Paysold. So it's all like fairly interesting. Silver mounted cello bow branded Kittel. Interesting. Yeah, some of this stuff would definitely worth looking at in person, I'd say. Nickel mounted cello bow branded K. Gerhard Penzel. Silver mounted cello bow branded A. Lamy Paris. So I expect all of these bids to really jump up. Silver mounted cello bow branded A. Lamy Paris. This is actually a really nice bow, just really tidy looking. Really interesting. So that's quite a nice one there. A small nickel mounted cello bow branded Ari France. I presume that this means it's some kind of child size one here. We can check the measurements there. 680 there. Silver mounted cello bow branded Emile Houchard. Okay. Yeah, it's all kind of like interesting looking. Silver mounted viola bow branded CH Nürnberger, or Nürnberger, I think that might be. Interesting, to say Nürnberger. I think it's Nern. Oh, that's something else. I need to brush up on my knowledge there. Nickel mounted viola bow branded HR Frechner. It's got the kind of emblem here on the frog. Not necessarily doesn't mean anything, but it definitely looks like an interesting one. Silver and mastic mounted violin bow unbranded. This is a curious one here. Interesting frog here. Kind of see-through. You can see like the pins there. Actually, it's quite interesting for showing how a frog is constructed there. So that is interesting. Quite curious figure actually on this stick. A big knot there in a bit of an unfortunate place, but interesting nevertheless. A silver mounted violin bow branded A. Lamy Paris. There's so many bows in this auction, it's just ridiculous. It's split into two sections. I think they have some bows, then they have violins, and they have bows again. So, yeah, a lot of stuff here. Silver mounted violin bow unbranded. I think there's a real opportunity here for some good stuff. Nickel mounted violin bow branded, and then they haven't put the brand. Okay, that's interesting. A few cataloguing things there which needs some attention. Nickel mounted violin bow branded Louis Bazar. I mean, it all looks, yeah, I'm repeating myself here, but it all looks fairly interesting. Silver mounted violin bow branded E. Sartre à Paris. That's kind of odd on the branding on the frog as well. It's got 110 bid on that. Silver mounted violin bow branded C. Bazar. I think we just need to keep moving, otherwise we'll be here forever. Silver mounted violin bow branded FN Vora à Paris. Also a fairly interesting looking bow, that as well. 150 bid on that. Nickel mounted violin bow indistinctly branded. Silver mounted violin bow branded Vigneron. Nickel mounted violin bow branded JTL. Okay. Silver mounted violin bow unbranded. It does have a massive BD on the side, to be fair. Nickel mounted violin bow branded Fonclause à Part. Okay. Silver mounted violin bow branded F. Vincent Lyon. Interesting head. Nickel mounted violin bow branded C. Bazar. Hopefully we go into some instruments soon, because I would like to see something else other than bows. Nickel mounted violin bow unbranded. Silver mounted violin bow branded Ordino à Paris. Nickel and plastic mounted violin bow branded Louis Bazar. Okay. And let's carry on. Silver mounted violin bow unbranded. Interesting. Right, let's see what else we got here. Silver mounted violin bow branded R&M Milan. So no certificates or anything spotted so far. Although I think when I looked at this auction before, there were a few things which they said something about a certificate, but could be wrong. Nickel mounted violin bow branded Husson de Fort à Paris. Nickel mounted violin bow branded Poisson à Paris. Completely trashing that. Silver mounted violin bow branded Poisson à Paris. I really need to learn how to say that properly, I think. Nickel mounted violin bow indistinctly stamped. Nickel mounted violin bow indistinctly branded. Gold and tortoiseshell mounted violin bow branded E. Sartre à Paris. So we've got £550 bid on that already. I mean, the fact that it has a tortoiseshell frog is probably going to mean something anyway, just by the fact that historically your kind of bows that were gold and tortoiseshell, that kind of denoted the kind of top level bow. The same with like the hill bows, a gold mounted kind of bow with a tortoiseshell frog with the fleur-de-lis on it. I think was the top level bow. Nickel mounted violin bow branded PC. Nickel mounted violin bow branded Charles Bailly. Right, a gold and tortoiseshell mounted violin bow branded E. Sartre, 160 on that. So that one looks slightly kind of interesting in a kind of slightly odd way. CITES listing on that one. Right, we're on to instruments now. A viola labelled Sonata Nemasani Samu. Okay, interesting. Let's have a look at this. Don't forget your... oh, you can rock it. That's quite interesting. Never noticed that before. But you've got this 360 thing that you can roll around. Current bid 45, 41 body length. That's pretty good modern length. Let's have a look. Further labelled Tavetota 1934 Clear Anza Zeged. So I think this is basically a label for Nemasani, the kind of really highly regarded kind of Hungarian maker. Whether or not it's anything to do with that, I don't know. Once again, very speculative, and it's not a style of making that I kind of recognise, to be honest, but curious looking, and there's definitely interest already. Viola labelled Leandro Biziak, 403 length of back on that. We won't spin that. That looks fairly generic to me, being honest, and also needs a lot of work. See no condition reports on this either, so well, probably good in a way because there's so many lots, so we can skip condition reports for now. Viola label Vincenzo Sanino, 1905, 406 length of back, 110 bid on this. Okay, just looks still fairly normal to me. It doesn't look like your normal like low end like trade workshop stuff. It looks like stuff which has been, made to be, a little bit kind of an unknown quantity, I would say. A viola labelled Matteo Goffrilla, 406 there, 45 the current bid, so that's popular. Quite a nice looking instrument there. It's had a wax seal on the back there, so it just looks fairly nice. I don't think it's particularly old, but seems like quite a nicely made instrument, to be honest. One worth looking at in person, I'd say. So that's curious. But we can probably zoom out a little bit actually on the instruments. A viola labelled Gaston Bargelli there. So we always check the length here. 407, well, everything's really good size. Just looks very new, in really good condition, so yeah, could be interesting. 350 bid on that. Ones to look at the auction. A viola zither labelled Michael Nowie. Okay, well, this is just one of those bizarre zither things that people were making, although slightly kind of unusual shape, but that fittings, that's very similar. You see like violin version, so it just, yeah, it's one of those slightly weird instruments. Right, a half-size violin labelled Francesco Ruggieri. Right, this is a very interesting instrument actually. I think this is quite curious. Let me just have a look at some of the quality of this kind of workmanship and kind of materials. Varnish for a half-size violin is quite striking, I think. Scroll is a little bit more kind of not as exciting, but an interesting one for sure. Just really interesting arching though. Look at that, it's like really quite bulbous. It's an interesting looking one. If we have a look at the condition reports here, we've got, looks like cheeks here on the back, some repairs, but not too bad condition. But that's an interesting looking violin there, child size violin. Violin labelled Joseph Hell, 475 bid on that already. It's in a tidy kind of condition, or fairly tidy. Well, we've got condition reports for some of these, so tiny little open cracks, that's good. So there are some condition reports up. Violin labelled Nikolai Lupo, 600 bid on this. This is what I mean, like we've got lots of bids already, and we're not really anywhere near the auction ending. Kind of interesting varnish on this one, quite long actually. Weird kind of F-holes. I wonder what the length is of this. Yeah, 362. That's fairly long. Violin labelled NF Viome. This looks fairly standard. Violin labelled Pierre Sylvestre, 220 on this. Varnish looks a bit funky. This is what I mean, this, a lot of this stuff looks very similar, like it was kind of made, you know, in the, I don't know, like kind of mid 20th century, even a little bit later, just to be just generic, but not like your 1900s kind of generic workshop stuff or Czech German, like to be like more general European, so it could be literally anything. So, and that's a lot of the confusing stuff that you get out here these days. Violin labelled Luigi Nettore Sofriti, 700 bid on this. Okay, so this is popular. Once again, it just gives me that same kind of like vibes of not really knowing what's going on. Seems to have some document here from Giuseppe Ornati, certificate there apparently. So, I mean, I don't know how much you can believe some of these historical certificates. To be honest, I would be very cautious. But once again, if you are an expert and you're looking at this auction, of which a lot of people, dealers, etc. do buy from Amati, they'll probably know. So if you're familiar with that maker's work, you could probably know if it's theirs or not. For me, I'm not really in that zone, unfortunately. A violin unlabelled. Okay, let's have a look at this. This looks kind of interesting. Quite like the F-holes on that. It's quite plain. Is it, looks like it, it's hard to say. It looks like it might have like an inked, is it inked back? Not 100% sure, it looks a bit like it, but fairly plain looking. Once again, it has that same kind of just generic vibe to it. Another unlabelled one here, but this is a really interesting auction, and there's definitely going to be people looking at this catalogue that can spot something. A violin branded AG, okay. Yeah, it's a lot of this stuff, I'm just like, no idea. Violin labelled Antonio Scarbi. I mean, the only thing I can really recognise when something's a little bit different is this is different kind of wood here, and the kind of outline's a bit curious. So varnish is a little bit interesting. This is quite interesting. These C bouts, you see, it's kind of like not even, it kind of cuts in. It's kind of odd wide part here, so that's a bit strange. What is the length about that? 358, that's pretty fair. Violin labelled Vincenzo Cavani. Okay, let's see here. Just looks all very generic, a lot of this stuff, which I would probably assume is Eastern Europe, but I really could be wrong, so use your own kind of thoughts on that. Same with a lot of this stuff, I just really find it hard to know. Really nice kind of interesting piece of wood here. Not sure exactly what's going on there. If that's maybe just some issue with the wood, I think it's probably just like a mineral line in the wood. So another one labelled Antonius Scarbi. Violin labelled Franciscus Geisenhoff here. This looks fairly standard. Violin labelled Laurentius Storioni here. Pretty weird F-holes on this. So very difficult to know what is going on with that. That's some bizarre varnish. Kind of interesting scroll here. It says here entirely revarnished. This is a kind of instrument where I would just personally just write this off as being just some messed about trade violin, but I don't know, because I have spoken to people before that have seen instruments that were, good instruments that were messed around with and revarnished by other people, and sometimes you can actually find good instruments amongst this kind of chaos of weird varnishing and stuff, so worth bearing in mind, but very odd looking F-holes in any case. So what is the length of the back of this one actually? 354. Yeah, interesting looking. Violin labelled Samuel Nemasani, so we've got a few Nemasani labelled things here. Once again, not really doing too much for me. And we've got violin labelled Giuseppe Adona. Actually quite like the scroll on that, that's quite nice. Once again, don't really know what to say. This video is probably not very useful. Violin labelled Johann George Lieb. Looks fairly standard. Violin labelled Giozo Ospito. So this is the kind of stuff that I'm quite interested in, just because it's so bizarre in its kind of outline, in the workmanship, that this is definitely, a handmade, amateur made thing, like without question. There's no way that this came from like a generic workshop at all, which in a way is kind of interesting to me personally, because I quite like weird stuff. Even by this scroll you can see everything is a little bit odd. Condition's quite good, so this could well be made by some random Italian person in 1901, or it could also be made anywhere in the world, because you've got lots of people making weird amateur stuff. But for me, it's interesting, and if the price doesn't go too high and the condition's okay, might be worth getting. 120 quid at the moment. It will probably go up a bit higher than that, but for me, that's kind of, at least interesting and believable, better than this generic stuff that we see. Violin labelled Schweitzer. This, I think, is probably a clear cut like trade violin. Violin unlabelled. It's fairly generic as well. So most of the stuff in this auction I think is highly speculative, but there is some straight up kind of just junky trade stuff. I think like some of this would be in that position as well. A few things labelled Tononi here. A lot of this stuff I personally wouldn't touch, but there are probably someone out there that knows a bit better than me. This looks kind of okay. Unfortunate crack there on the back, but it actually looks fairly nice there. So big soundpost crack in the back, but workmanship's quite nice for that. Violin labelled Jacobus. Okay, this is an interesting looking one. Yeah, quite interesting violin this. Saying Parma 1672, head not original. What's the length of back there? 356, almost certainly some kind of 18th century violin there. A lot of repairs there on the front. Interesting, back is okay. Yeah, interesting one that, 160 current bid, if you like older instruments. A violin unlabelled. This I think is really interesting. Like these kind of splayed out F-holes. That's a curious looking one here. That back is a bit bizarre. Let's have a look at what the scroll looks like. Yeah, I mean, I think it's most likely something kind of German, but it's got some flair to it. It's kind of interesting. Let's look at the condition report. A few big cracks there. Violin labelled Paulino Chiresci, 150 on this. It's got this quite wide edge work, all the purflings in quite from the edge, which I always think of as some kind of Hungarian thing, but could be wrong. It's got a lot of cracks there in the front. Violin labelled Nikolai Amati. This I think is probably that's a generic trade instrument for sure. Violin bearing a repairer's label. Okay, that is kind of a highly mashed up instrument there. Neck separated from body. I mean, the body itself looks kind of interesting below this destroyed varnish, but what it is, I don't know. A real project violin there. Violin labelled Thomas Balistieri Cremonensis. Later head sold with what purports to be the certificate of Friedrich Bohm. Also purports to be a certificate of E.R. Voigt and Son, London. Okay, 1300 bid on this, so it is an interesting looking violin though. That is a beautiful back, I have to say. Actually, it's really nice colour to the varnish, one which would be worth looking at in person. Kind of similar kind of varnish to that little half size violin that we looked at, but yeah, it's an interesting looking one, so I can understand why the bid's already quite high. Quite a cool scroll as well, so that one I think is one worth looking at. Let's have a look at the body length, 357. Oh, they got the certificates up as well, so that'll be good entertainment. Let's have a look. Yeah, who knows with some of this stuff. So, I mean, that one, there's obviously no images, so who knows. But a lot has changed in the last kind of 50 years in terms of authenticating things. Yeah, curious, interesting looking kind of shape. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting one, that one. I would bookmark that one for sure. Another one labelled Thomas Balistieri here, 170 on this one, so not quite so popular. That's a really beautiful piece of wood on the back though, look at that. That is really nice. That's another really interesting violin here. Let's have a look at the scroll on that. That's looks like a very German scroll, but the back on that's wonderful back. So that is quite cool. Violin, Balistieri again. Okay, we're really cracking out here. Some more kind of aggressive Guarneri style F-holes here. Yeah, it's kind of interesting looking. Good state of preservation. 350 on that. What's the length of the back? Let's just see. 351. Okay, interesting. That's curious. Violin labelled Joseph Guarnerius. Right, now this, I think, is possibly the nicest violin in this auction. I just think it's really, really interesting. It's already got 2,400 bid. I have no idea what this is. Absolutely at all. No idea. But that is a stunning looking back on that. I suspect that this is going to sell for at least 10,000, I would think. I'm really convinced that that's going to sell for at least 10,000. That would be my opinion. 354 length of back. It's got a lot of things going for it. Let's look at the condition report here. The condition is not too bad either. I mean, it's got the varnish is slightly weird here, and it's quite an aggressive styling, but I like that. I think that's an interesting looking violin. Another violin, wow, labelled to us by the stereo. It's just very odd looking. That looks a bit more modern and a bit like some of the other dodgy stuff that we've seen earlier. Violin Scarabotto, let's have a look. But pretty cool stuff so far. I quite like this auction. Violin unlabeled, that's pretty funky looking thing as well. Yeah, interesting. 160 bid on that so far. Violin labelled Petrus Guarnerius, 100 bid on that. That's quite a kind of odd choice of wood. Varnish is a bit funny on that one. Once again, looks like one of those slightly bizarre ones. Violin labelled Camillus Camilli. Looks a bit too modern for that, but curious enough. I think we might switch to some other. I think we might have some more bows appearing at some point. Violin labelled David Tekla. Quite nice back on that. It's quite interesting. Varnish, quite nice looking violin. Very German kind of scroll there. 230 bid on that. I think that's quite nice. What's the 359? Yeah, it's fairly big. Violin unlabelled. Another curious one with some interesting F-holes here. Yeah, another one that's definitely interesting. Violin labelled Stelik Lajos. That's had a bit of a battering. That looks pretty generic, I would think. Violin labelled Petrus Guarnerius. That's a beautiful bit of wood actually at the back. Nice varnish. This doesn't look too old, but I quite like it actually. I think this is quite a nice looking violin. This is one of these things where, like, who knows what it actually is. Kind of interesting model shape, but if it's in good condition, it sounds good. Why not? If you're a player or a shop or something, could be a pretty cool thing. Condition looks pretty good. Yeah, that's quite cool. That, I think, I'm sure that will sell for like a couple of grand at least, just because it's in really good condition. Looks interesting. Who knows where that has come from, but yeah, really nice wood. Maybe the varnish antiquing is not wonderful, but I think it's quite interesting. Violin unlabelled. This looks very generic. Yeah, it's very horrible looking thing. Violin labelled Pietro Antonio Dalla Costa. A curious looking thing here as well. That's quite cool. Quite like that. Looks like, is that inked purfling? It's hard to tell. Maybe not. No, it looks like it's real purfling. Yeah, it's kind of interesting looking. Quite like it. 90s bid on that. Fairly generic scroll though. Violin labelled Samuel Nemasani. Yeah, looks like another kind of generic-y type thing. Violin unlabelled. This is, I think, one of these trade ones with this banding is like that. Yeah, and your trade lion head there. Violin labelled Tommaso Ebela. Okay. And violin unlabelled, kind of Guarneri-esque F-holes there. Just looks like a fairly modern thing. Violin labelled Gio Battista Gabrielli. It's an interesting outline on that. Yeah, I quite like that. And condition is not too bad. Bit of worm attack there, but that's interesting. 110 bid on that. That's quite interesting. Let's look at the length back. 358. Okay. Violin labelled Dominicus Montagnana. Okay. Another curious one that looks like it's been heavily over varnished. That scroll is pretty horrible. What's it say here? There's a lot of repairs on that. Let's just check the length of back on that one as well. 355. Okay. Violin branded Amatus. That's nice. Yeah, that's another really nice looking instrument there. That is quite interesting. Looks like maybe the neck is not original. It says head later, but I think the whole thing. Yeah, that's not bad. 353. That's quite a good size there. Violin unlabelled. Scroll by another hand. Looks quite similar to one of the other ones we saw earlier. Cool, nice bit of wood. That's really interesting. Someone's carved something in the back there. So let's just quickly check that. 355. Okay. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. I think that is fairly generic as well. Yeah, that's pretty nasty. Violin labelled Gasparo de Salo. That also looks pretty. Yeah, it's just generic. So there's a few generic things in here. Violin labelled Nicholas Amatus. This is also looking fairly generic. So we're into some pretty horrible territory at the moment. Same here. So we've hit a rut of not very good stuff. Let's have a look at this one. This looks like highly messed about with instrument. Might have been interesting at some point, but not so much anymore. Another violin, Nicholas Amati. This is just another tradey thing, but with weirdly cut F holes. Probably early 20th century, something like that. This much the same. Kind of almost tell what these are going to look like on the back from the front after you've looked at enough of them. Now, this is an interesting violin just from the choice of wood, really. Violin labelled Natale Novelli. So it's interesting, kind of what they call kind of bear claw. I presume that rather than dodgy varnishing on the front, so that's quite interesting. Nice kind of bird's eye actually on the back, and quite a tight kind of bird's eye. Clearly not a particularly old instrument here, but the varnish looks kind of nice enough, and workmanship is interesting. 1947, could it be that old? Not sure, could be. Can be misleading sometimes, but interesting looking violin anyway. Violin labelled Enzo Arasi here. It just looks fairly generic to me. Violin labelled manufactured in Berlin. It's just another generic instrument, so there are a few kind of pretty boring things. Some people like this kind of carved thing, but this is just a trade violin of some kind. Violin labelled Carlo Bergonzi. Okay. Kind of interesting looking, but also not interesting at the same time. Another violin labelled Carlo Bergonzi. It's a little bit mashed up. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Okay. Violin labelled Carlo Bergonzi again, so that's a really cool back as well. That's really interesting. Yeah, that's quite a fancy back. It's a bit odd kind of shape though. It's a bit square, a bit boxy. Almost like some of the later kind of 19th century stuff with the Hopf kind of stamp or something like that. It's a little bit odd. What's the length of the back on it? 354, okay, it's interesting, but nice wood at the back. This is just some bonkers thing, isn't it? So I think it can be fairly safe to say that that is an amateur-made thing, but curious nevertheless. Violin labelled Marengo Rinaldi. Just another generic instrument there. 4 violins. Okay, are we going to bother to look at this stuff? I think this is just pretty generic stuff. So yeah, I don't think there's any point in really looking at this. 4 violins, yeah. 4 violins, have a look at it yourself if you've got time. 4 violins, I think this is going to be generic. Not going to look at these bow bundles either, but have a look if you get a chance. There might be some interesting stuff in there for sure. Definitely worth having a look if you are a person interested in bows, but for me, I'm not too fussed, to be honest. Sometimes these bow bundles can have some really great stuff in it, but it takes a bit of effort. Bow cases here, always useful. Some of them look fairly decent, but not super exciting to look at. Also, we have bloody huge auction still to go through. 4-pack violin cases, quite useful. So it's a few options there. Wow, 48 slot bow case. That's a big one. More bow cases there. Right, we're on to books now. So a few interesting things. Right, so books. We have Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù by Peter Biddulph, deluxe version. Pretty sure this sells for like over £1,000 usually, so I'm sure that will do pretty well. I've never actually looked inside this book before, I have to be honest, and I've seen it for sale at auctions before, and I could have looked at it, but I've genuinely never looked at it, to be honest. Italian Violin Makers by Walter Hammer, standard. I think this is kind of whatever records of instrument sales or something like that. French bows, Stradivari thing. Stringed instruments collection of the Library of Congress. Some other bits as well. Antonio Stradivari by Just Thone. Once again, never looked in this book either. Le Violin there. 4 Centuries of Violin Making, Sotheby's Archive. That's the Tim Ingalls of kind of Ingalls and Heyday fame there. Stradivari Legacy, more Strad related stuff. Strad in Japan, Marassi, interesting. Master German violin makers. Treasures of French Lutherie, Amati family stuff there. Guadagnini, modern Italian violins there, and some other kind of violin stuff. Garamberti, violin something, whatever. Marassi book as well. More stuff about Stradivari. Bows for musical instruments. Piccat book there. Right, back to bows again. I think we can also zoom back in again a little bit. Okay, nickel-mounted double bass bow branded R. Herbert Licht. Nickel-mounted double bass bow indistinctly. Silver-mounted cello bow branded A. L'Ami à Paris. Silver-mounted cello bow branded Paris. Silver-mounted cello bow branded C.H. Husson à Paris. Silver-mounted cello bow branded Victor Fatigue à Paris. Let's have a look at that. Current bid 190. Okay, looks like no condition reports for bows as yet, but I'm sure they'll come. Nickel-mounted cello bow branded H.R. Frechner. Silver-mounted cello bow branded L. Morrison. Nickel-mounted cello bow branded L. Thomas à Paris. Silver-mounted cello bow branded Piccat. 160 on that. Interesting sweep on the head. Silver-mounted cello bow branded Adam. There's definitely a few interesting bows in this sale. Nickel-mounted cello bow branded E. Sartre à Paris. Okay. Silver-mounted cello bow branded H. Knopf. Nickel-mounted cello bow branded A. L'Ami à Paris. Actually interested to see how this sale goes. It looks like there's not a picture there. Because it's in July, is usually a pretty dead time for auctions, so that'd be interesting. Bow branded Usha there. Nickel-mounted cello bow unbranded. Silver-mounted cello bow branded Silvestre. Silver-mounted cello bow branded El Morizo. Okay, that's interesting. Silver-mounted cello bow branded Gandon Bernardel Paris. Yeah, quite a lot of cello bows. We haven't seen any cellos actually, that's a fair point. Silver-mounted cello bow branded Louis Bazar. Silver-mounted cello bow unbranded. Silver-mounted cello bow unbranded there. Small nickel-mounted cello bow unbranded. Nickel-mounted viola bow unbranded. Sound with certificate of Pierre Testa, Paris, 2001. Okay. Can we read anything of this? No. Let's not get into that. That's too complicated. Nickel-mounted violin bow, viola bow, branded Charles Bailly. So I guess the weight must be, somewhere on that borderline. Silver-mounted viola bow, branded Schmidt. Silver-mounted violin bow, branded Cuneo Huri. This is fairly interesting. Gold-mounted violin bow. Don't really like the head on that, but interesting. Gold and ivory. A nickel-mounted violin bow branded Tubbs. That looks fairly modern to me. Silver-mounted violin bow unbranded. A nickel-mounted violin bow branded G. Hernsdorf. Nickel-mounted viola bow unbranded. Okay. Nickel-mounted violin bow unbranded. Nickel-mounted violin bow unbranded. Silver-mounted violin bow branded Louis Bazar. Nickel-mounted violin bow unbranded there. Silver-mounted violin bow unbranded. Silver-mounted violin bow unbranded. Silver-mounted violin bow unbranded. Okay. Silver-mounted violin bow unbranded again. Okay, we're getting into a lot of that. Nickel-mounted violin bow branded Herman. Silver-mounted violin bow unbranded. Nickel-mounted violin bow unbranded. That's got weird. Nickel-mounted violin bow unbranded. Silver-mounted violin bow unbranded. Nothing too exciting so far. Silver-mounted violin bow unbranded. Nickel-mounted violin bow unbranded. Nicomata branded R. Werner. Jazzy Mounts. Unlikely to be original. Okay. Nicomata unbranded there. A Nicomata branded Mark Lebert. Silvermanta branded Gustav Praja. Let's actually have a look at this and see. Right. Silvermanta branded Andres Morelli. Nothing really looking super exciting at the moment. Silvermanta branded a Maurice Alil. Kind of Marisa Alil even. It's fairly interesting. Okay, we're on to cellos here. Cello unlabeled. This looks like some pretty terrible generic trade cello, to be quite honest. Right, and that's what back to violas. Okay, so there wasn't many cellos, it seems. So let's zoom back out again so we can see stuff better. A viola labelled Annibale Fagnola. Quite a nice back on that, but looks very modern. What's the length of the back there? 404. Everything's a really good size in the viola world so far. Viola labelled Giovanni Cavani. Once again, in very good condition. 393, it's a bit smaller. Viola labelled Grancino. That looks very messed around with. What is the size though? 388, yeah. Bit small. Viola unlabelled. That looks to be extremely generic and quite modern. 409 on that one. Viola labelled Joseph Rocca. Once again, well, this kind of generic looking stuff. 390. Alright, back onto violins. A violin labelled Giuseppe Serretta. Interesting. That's nice back on that actually. Looks pretty tidy. Good condition. Let's have a look at the length of back. 354, that's pretty good. I mean, these kind of instruments, I think you just have to take them as, you know, what they are really. It's quite nice woods there, and if it plays well, in good condition, it's worth, you know, if you think about the price of a new decent kind of violin in the shop or whatever, it's probably worth taking a bit of a risk. As if you can play it in person, it's probably a good idea. It looks nice enough though, quite like that. What violin unlabelled? This looks pretty generic to me. Violin labelled Giuseppe Vignale or Vignale. One day I will learn names, but not today. Violin unlabelled. Let's see what's going on here. Yeah, it just looks very generic, so we've hit a generic spot again. Violin labelled Joseph Guarnerius. Okay, looks fairly generic. Violin labelled M. Cottereau. Yeah, that's a horrid thing. Violin labelled Joseph Guarnerius. I think this is also probably nothing too exciting there. Violin labelled Ancionazzi Romeo. Looks also fairly generic. A violin labelled Ferrotti Celeste. Once again, same thing. Violin labelled Giuseppe Corsi. Also fairly standard. Violin labelled Sanctus Seraphin. Quite a nice back on that actually, I have to say. It's fairly nice. Nice varnish, but once again just looks in that same kind of like kind of realm, especially on the scrolls. All the scrolls just seem to look the same. Violin unlabelled. This is a bit of a interesting one here. Curious F-hole positions. Violin labelled Johannes Antonius Marchi. Okay, it's got 700 bid on that. I'll be honest, I have no idea why someone has bid 700 on that. I really don't understand at all. But okay, 356. Assume that someone knows something more than I do. But yeah, interesting. Violin labelled Nicholas Galliano there. It's very generic as well. Violin labelled Garancino. This looks kind of a bit more interesting. Yeah, half interesting. It's got 1,000 bid though, so that's popular. 351 length of back though, that's curious. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Yeah, more generic stuff there. Violin labelled Joseph Guarnerius. It's going to be a long video. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. 1,000 bid on this. Yeah, I think this is a fairly interesting violin actually, looking at the some of the corner work and things going on here. Quite nice scroll as well. So yeah, interesting one. Let's have a look at the 360 though, quite long. Violin labelled Stradivarius again. Halfway interesting. Violin signed internally Andrea Corsi. Looks fairly generic to me. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Let's actually just have a quick look at the back on that one again. Okay, I think fairly standard. Violin labelled Francesco Ruggieri. Looks quite a nice scroll actually on the side. That's very neat. But otherwise, not sure. Violin unlabelled here. I think once again nothing too crazy. Another violin unlabelled. Okay. Violin labelled Petrus Guarnerius. I think this was possibly a nice instrument at some point. It's got a lot of repairs there. 353, okay, interesting. Violin labelled Jacobus Steiner. This looks like your generic type thing. Yeah. Violin labelled Petrus Guarnerius again. This looks like some kind of German thing. But actually fairly nice back. It looks like it's got really bad sound post crack in the back. Otherwise it would have been quite a nice one, I think. That is a lot problematic, I would say. 353. Violin labelled Petrus Gagini. It's fairly standard. Violin labelled Stefano Scarampella. It's quite wide, that instrument actually, for a violin. Yeah, 355 length of back. Kind of curious looking one. Violin labelled Scarampella again. Still very generic. Violin labelled Giuseppe Pedrazzini. Yeah, this one is kind of interesting. Just looking at the varnish, the kind of quality of that varnish and the wood underneath. But it does have kind of similar traits to the others, so. But halfway interesting that. 361 length of back. Violin labelled Guadagnini. Just looks kind of another fairly interesting one, but it looks a little bit funky. 356 length of back there. Violin labelled Ernesto Pivere. A kind of interesting choice of wood for the scroll, but not quite sure about that. Violin labelled David Tekla. This is pretty bonkers one as well, from a shape point of view. Quite like this actually. Quite nice wood. I think it's an interesting one, that one. It's got a lot of work done to it. What's the 358? Something I'd probably put a few £100 into, but I wouldn't pay too much for it. But violin labelled Joseph Guarnerius. It's very generic. Violin unlabelled. These corners just looks like something which has been messed around with. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Another one that looks like it's fairly wide body. I think that's fairly generic here. Violin labelled Sanctus Seraphim. Actually fairly interesting back on that, but I suspect it's nothing too crazy. Violin labelled Plinio Michetti. Okay, interesting. So this one has 1300 bid. Once again, I'm not familiar with this maker, and to me it doesn't look like anything too exciting, but I said I'm not an expert. Violin labelled Vincentius. I wonder if that's meant to say Postiglione rather than Potiglione, but maybe not. Maybe that's just something funny going on there. Who knows, but nothing too exciting. Violin labelled Renato Scrollavezza. Once again, very kind of good condition, quite modern looking there, 354. Violin unlabelled, in a bit of a funny state. A nice back to it as well, fairly interesting. Violin unlabelled again, this looks to be a pretty standard looking thing, just flat varnish and not very exciting. Violin unlabelled, this is just another bonkers thing, so quite cool wood though. Wow, that is a really interesting scroll, so some kind of bizarre amateur made thing that. Violin labelled Jean-Baptiste Viaume. Just looks like a kind of generic-y trade instrument there. Another Viaume labelled thing. Double purfling, looks fairly generic. Violin labelled Guarnerius. Kind of interesting outline on this, but it just looks a bit funky. 352. Violin labelled Joseph Nadotti, another bonkers looking thing there. I wonder how, is that really long? 361, it's not too long, but weird outline. Violin labelled Petrus Guarnerius. Yes, halfway interesting. Quite nice scrolls, but everything looks like it's been messed around with a bit. I'm just really a bit sceptical of a lot of these things. Violin unlabelled here. Suspect that this is just a generic kind of trade thing with some funky antiquing. Violin labelled Raffaele Desideri. Very interesting F holes on that. Quite nice varnish. I think that'll do quite well. What's the back on that? 354. Violin unlabelled. This looks probably quite generic. Okay. Oh dear. Violin unlabelled. This also looks pretty generic. Violin labelled Johannes Franciscus Presender. Once again, fairly generic looking. Violin labelled Alexander Delanoy. Actually kind of half interesting on the varnish point of view. 600 bid on that, I think that will do quite well. Violin labelled Annibale Fagnola. This one was sold as certificate of something, that kind of wood again. Stefano Cogna, certificate there. Violin labelled Petrus Guarnerius. I mean, even if this certificate's wrong, it probably does add a bit of value having a wrong certificate to it. Violin labelled Carlo Giuseppe Odone. That's again fairly generic. Violin labelled Ferrotti Celeste. Kind of curious, but also generic at the same time. Violin labelled Vincenzo Tresiano Panormo. Definitely not. Violin labelled Gio Battista Gabrielli. 1100 on that. This, I think, is quite an interesting one as well. Scroll not quite sure about, but yeah, I think this is an interesting looking violin. Some funny bits going on with the F holes, open seam, but some of it I think is quite interesting. I think this is one worth looking at the 360 viewer on. It's fairly strong arching on that, so I think this is an interesting one. This is one to watch out for, I would say. Right, violin labelled Petrus Antonius Alvelti. Kind of wiry F holes on that, very kind of uninspiring, I think. Violin labelled Gabriele again here. Quite nice back on that, actually. Be quite nice. Maybe we should have a look, a bit of a zoom in to the back of this and just see. Yeah, it looks like is that a massive repair at the back? It looks like a massive brick repair on the back. See what it says on condition report. Yeah, kind of misleading there because you can't really see what the original button looked like, but yeah, halfway interesting. Violin labelled Petrus Antonius Malvolti. Interesting varnish on that and edge work. Quite cool scroll actually on the side. That is fairly curious. 355 length of back on that. We must be coming to the end of instruments soon, I would have thought. Another Gabrielli labelled thing, fairly generic. Violin unlabelled. Three violins and a mute violin. Okay. Some weird stuff going on here. Okay, violin with a bit of a cutaway. Seems to be some kind of mute violin. Well, there are people that collect these mute violins, so that might do well just for that. 4 violins, we're not going to get into that. 6 violins, child-size violin and a pochette. Let's have a look at that. So it's fairly curious. Interesting enough, kind of slightly weird looking thing there. A guitar, unlabelled, interesting. Guitar, unexpected. Looks like it's had a bit of a life to it, nothing too crazy. Interesting enough, but nothing too mad. Right, a Viola d'Amore labelled Carlo Giuseppe Milano. Okay, 210 on that. Interesting. Doesn't look like the greatest of quality, to be honest, but interesting anyway. Some bows here. Once again, we're not going to get into the bows or save everyone the show. Oh, actually, there's a different. Let's have a look at this. A bundle of bows, bass bows there. Okay, interesting. So there is one of these kind of like Dragonetti type bass bows in here. So I think that this might sell for quite a bit if people see that, because those are quite valuable. Some more bows there. More bows. More bows. Got more bows. Okay, so there's a lot of bow bundles here, so a lot of opportunities here for people. Wow, okay, more bow cases as well. I presume they're selling all the cases that the stuff came in. More bow cases there. Oh, that's an interesting violin case. 70 bid on that. That's kind of a curious looking one, isn't it? Wow. Yeah, interesting. A 4-pack violin case, unbranded. Okay, more 4-pack violin cases. Okay. Oh, right, okay, what's this? A violin case branded Custodia Tropicaliazza. Also another interesting looking case there. Violin and viola case, more bow cases. More bow cases. Right, books again. A violino, about Sacconi book there. That violino book in, and another copy. Okay. Dutch and Austrian making there. Pajot book. Guarneri book. Masterworks of Italian violin making. Dictionary. The Golden Bow. Jean-Baptiste Fillon book there. Oh, this book again. Yep, more books. Strad. Contemporary Cremonese violin making there. Some books about something. There seems to be quite a few. La Archette volumes 1 to 3, which I think is the real kind of decent book on bows. So 650 on that. I think that usually sells for over 1,000. Bongart's, the auction house, which I don't think really runs anymore in Germany. Volumes 1 and 2 of some kind of sale. Cremona Luthia book. And, oh, right, okay, I think that's it. Right, okay, well, that was a bit of an epic video, but we've completed that sale now. Thanks for lasting the whole video, if you did manage to do that. What to say, a pretty bizarre auction, very speculative across the board. There are clearly some really interesting bows and some very interesting violins. There's also some pretty generic stuff. There's some stuff which is in good condition, which might be just a nice sounding instrument that you can get for a few £1,000s, but I'm sure there's a couple of instruments in there that are really something quite special, and the same with bows, so definitely worth having a look. If anyone's got any comments, feel free to let me know. Please support me in any way that you can. I will try and upload these videos onto different platforms now, so if there's any way that you can support me, it'd be much appreciated. So until next time, take care, and I shall see you all soon. Bye.